Stanford Prison Experiment, a simple study that was never meant to spiral into chaos, a controlled environment that became something else, a psychological experiment that revealed something raw, something unsettling, something about the darkness that hides beneath the surface of human nature. The plan was simple. A group of ordinary college students divided into two roles, prisoners and guards. A simulated prison set up in the basement of Stanford University, meant to observe the psychological effects of power and confinement. The experiment was supposed to last 2 weeks. It didn't even make it that far. At first, it was just a game. The prisoners were dressed in identical smocks, assigned numbers instead of names. The guards were given uniforms, sunglasses, batons. There were no real criminals here, no real authority figures, just students playing roles, just people following a script. But the moment the doors locked, the moment the guards took their positions, something changed. The roles weren't just roles anymore. The uniform wasn't just a uniform. The prison wasn't just a simulation. The guards started testing their power, not because they were told to, but because they could. What began as small exercises in control, making prisoners stand in line, enforcing arbitrary rules, quickly escalated. The guards became stricter, their punishments harsher. They forced prisoners to do push-ups, deprived them of sleep, humiliated them for minor infractions, and the prisoners, they broke down. Some resisted, some withdrew, some accepted their fate. The experiment was never about physical violence. There were no weapons, no real threats of harm. But the psychological toll was real. The prisoners began to see themselves as powerless. They followed orders, not because they were forced to, but because resistance seemed impossible. The guards, on the other hand, became something else. They stopped seeing the prisoners as fellow students, as equals. They became enforcers, taking their roles further than anyone expected. The worst of it wasn't in the physical punishments, but in the dehumanization. The guards stripped prisoners of their dignity, forced them to repeat their numbers until they lost any sense of identity. They created punishments not to maintain order, but to establish dominance. They controlled food, sleep, even basic bodily functions. They turned prisoners against each other, rewarding obedience, punishing defiance. The man behind the experiment, psychologist Philip Zimbardo, watched from the sidelines. At first, he saw it as valuable research, data being collected, human nature being studied. But soon, even he was drawn into the illusion. He stopped seeing students playing roles, and started seeing actual prisoners, actual guards. He let it continue, even as it spiraled further into something that no longer resembled science. It took 6 days for the experiment to fall apart, not because the guards stopped, not because the prisoners revolted, but because someone from the outside saw what was happening and questioned how it was allowed to continue. Zimbardo's own colleagues, even he himself, had become too absorbed to see the ethical lines they had crossed. The experiment ended, but the questions it raised never did. What does it take for ordinary people to become something else? How thin is the line between order and cruelty? How quickly does power corrupt when there are no consequences? The Stanford Prison Experiment showed that the roles people are placed in can shape them in ways they don't expect, in ways they don't question until it's too late. The guards weren't monsters before they put on the uniforms. The prisoners weren't weak before they stepped into the cell. But the environment created something new, something that felt real, something that became more than just an experiment. In the years that followed, the experiment was dissected, criticized, debated. Some called it unethical, a violation of the very people it sought to study. Others argued that the results were flawed, that the guards knew what was expected of them, that the situation was engineered for conflict, but none of that changed what was seen, what was felt, what was recorded. The The Stanford prison experiment wasn't just about authority, it was about identity, about how quickly people lose themselves when the world around them tells them who they are. It was about the power of institutions, about how systems shape behavior, about how the right or wrong conditions can bring out something people never knew was inside them. It was supposed to be an experiment in human psychology. Instead, it became a lesson in human nature, a reminder that sometimes the biggest danger isn't in the rules that are enforced, but in the ones that people follow without ever questioning why. The Milgram Experiment, a study that was never about electricity, never about switches, never about the machine that stood between a person and the suffering of another. It was about obedience, about how far people would go when told to, about the unsettling reality that authority, not cruelty, is often enough to make ordinary people do the unthinkable. The experiment was deceptively simple. A researcher in a lab coat, clipboard in hand, instructing a participant to administer electric shocks to a stranger in another room. A machine lined with switches, each one increasing in voltage. The person on the other side of the wall was an actor, unseen but heard, their responses scripted, their cries pre-recorded, their suffering an illusion. But to the one pressing the switches, to the one being told to continue, it felt real. The setup was designed to test a question that had haunted psychologists, historians, and ethicists alike. In the wake of World War II, in the aftermath of the atrocities committed, not by psychopaths or monsters, but by seemingly ordinary men, following orders, Stanley Milgram wanted to understand something simple but terrifying. How much harm would a person inflict on another simply because they were told to? The participant believed they were taking part in a study on learning. They were told that their role was to administer shocks whenever the person in the other room gave a wrong answer. With each mistake, the voltage would increase. At first, the responses were mild, grunts of discomfort, strained words of protest, but as the voltage climbed, so did the reactions, pleading, screams, desperate cries for the experiment to stop, silence, and yet the voice of the authority figure remained calm. Please continue. The experiment must go on. You have no choice. There was always a choice, but time and time again, participants hesitated, questioned, faltered, and continued. They weren't forced. There were no threats, no punishments if they refused, just the presence of an authority figure, just the quiet but firm reassurance that they would not be held responsible, that it was necessary, that it was part of the study, and that was enough. Most participants showed visible distress. They sweated, trembled, protested. Some laughed nervously. Others pleaded for permission to stop. Some pressed the switches with shaking hands, but an overwhelming number of them, ordinary people, strangers off the street, kept going, even when they believed the person on the other side had stopped responding, even when the silence stretched too long, even when they were sure the shocks were fatal. 65% of participants continued, all the way to the highest voltage. They did not continue because they enjoyed it. They did not continue because they wanted to. They continued because they were told to, because someone in a position of authority told them it was necessary, because the presence of an official, of a lab coat, of a clipboard, was enough to override their own morality, their own instincts, their own doubt. Milgram's experiment shattered the idea that cruelty requires intent. It showed that under the right conditions, under the right structure, people will inflict suffering, not because they want to, but because they feel they must. That when responsibility is shifted to an authority figure, personal morality becomes secondary. The study became one of the most infamous in the history of psychology. People did not want to believe the results. They did not want to believe that the capacity for blind obedience was so deeply ingrained. that the line between right and wrong could be blurred so easily. But the evidence was there. It was undeniable. The implications were staggering. It wasn't about a single experiment in a controlled lab. It was about history, about the way governments, militaries, institutions manipulate obedience. It explained how people could carry out atrocities, not out of hatred, but out of duty. How war crimes, genocide, systemic oppression could be executed, not by villains, but by people who convinced themselves they had no other choice. Milgram's work faced criticism, not just for its ethical concerns, but for what it suggested about human nature. Some argued that the experiment was too artificial, that people only obeyed because they knew they were in a study, that in the real world they would act differently. But the echoes of the experiment could be found in history, in events that had already happened, in acts committed not by the uniquely evil, but by the painfully ordinary. The Milgram experiment wasn't about electricity. It was about the fragility of morality under pressure, about how quickly personal conscience can be overridden by authority, about how people will do things they never thought themselves capable of, not because they are cruel, but because someone told them it was the right thing to do. It revealed something unsettling, something that most people do not want to confront, that the question isn't whether authority can make people do terrible things. The question is, under the right conditions, would you? The third wave experiment. It was supposed to be a lesson, a demonstration, a way to explain something that history had already written in blood. A high school classroom in California, a teacher with a question, and a group of students who never thought they would become part of something bigger than themselves. It was not a psychological study in a lab, not a controlled experiment with researchers and data. It was real, and it happened fast. In 1967, high school teacher Ron Jones stood before his history class at Cubberley High School. The topic was Nazi Germany. The question was simple. How could an entire country follow a leader like Hitler? How could ordinary people become part of something so destructive, so unquestioning, so absolute? His students had the same answer most people did. It couldn't happen again. They would never fall for something like that. They would never let themselves be manipulated like that. Jones decided to prove them wrong. The next day, he introduced new rules: discipline, strict posture, sharp, coordinated movements, clear, simple answers to questions. He turned the class into something different, an organization. The students were no longer individuals, they were part of a group. They called it the third wave. At first, it was just an experiment, just an exercise, but it didn't stay that way. The students followed the new structure eagerly, embracing the sense of belonging, of order, of purpose. What started with a few rules quickly grew into a movement. They had a salute, they had slogans, they had ranks. Those who questioned it were pushed aside. Those who embraced it felt something they had never felt before: power in unity. By the third day, the third wave had spread beyond the classroom. More students wanted in. Membership cards were issued. Secret enforcers ensured that the rules were followed. Whispers of rebellion were crushed, not by the teacher, but by the students themselves. They were not forced to obey. They wanted to. By the fourth day, it was no longer a game. The students were completely absorbed. They were willing to follow, willing to enforce, willing to silence those who did not belong. They no longer needed to be told to act this way. It had become instinct. And then, on the fifth day, Jones ended it. He gathered the students, told them that the third wave was not just an experiment, but a demonstration of how easily fascism takes hold, how quickly people surrender their individuality for the promise of order, how willingly they trade freedom for belonging. They were stunned. Some denied it, some broke down, others sat in silence, realizing for the first time that they had become part of the very thing they believed could never happen again. The third wave experiment was not supposed to go this far. It was not supposed to become real, but it did. And that was the point. It revealed something that history had already proven, that authoritarian movements do not rise because of one leader. They rise because people allow them to. Because people want to be part of something bigger than themselves. Because order is comforting. Because when everyone around you is following the same path, it becomes easier to go along than to question. It showed that the warning signs of fascism are not always loud, not always violent, not always forced upon people. Sometimes they come quietly, disguised as unity, as discipline, as something that feels right in the moment. Ron Jones' experiment lasted only 5 days, but the lesson it taught has never faded. The third wave was not about history, it was about the present, about the fact that the potential for blind obedience, for conformity, for authoritarian thinking, is not something that existed only in the past. It is something that exists in every society, in every generation, in every group that believes it is immune to the mistakes of those who came before. It was not a study in a laboratory. It was not controlled, not observed from behind a glass wall. It was real. And that is what makes it impossible to ignore. The Robbers' Cave Experiment, a study designed to observe conflict, but in the end, it revealed something much deeper about human nature. It did not need manipulation, coercion, or force. The divisions formed naturally. The hostility emerged on its own. And when the time came, so did something else, something that could not be explained by competition alone. In the summer of 1954, psychologist Muzaffer Sherif took 22 11-year-old boys to a summer camp in Oklahoma. They did not know they were part of an experiment. They believed they were simply going on a camping trip, ready for games, adventure, and summer fun. They were all carefully chosen, middle class, well-adjusted, similar in background. There were no pre-existing differences to divide them, no obvious reason for conflict, no reason to believe that, within days, they would see each other as enemies. For the first few days, the boys were split into 2 groups. They were kept apart, unaware of the other group's existence. They played together, formed friendships, built identities. Each group developed its own culture, its own leadership, its own name. One called themselves the Rattlers, the other, the Eagles. These names mattered. They were not just words, they were symbols of who they were, of who belonged. And when the researchers introduced them to each other, those symbols became something more. At first, it was competition. A tournament was set up, tug of war, baseball, challenges that pitted one group against the other. There was no real reward, only pride, only victory, only the knowledge that one team had won and the other had lost. But that was enough. It started with name-calling, small acts of defiance, harmless pranks, but it escalated. The Rattlers took over the baseball field and refused to let the Eagles play. The Eagles stole from the Rattlers' camp in retaliation. The hostility grew with every game, every challenge, every moment. They were told that the other team was their rival. By the time the tournament was over, they were not just 2 groups of boys at a summer camp. They were enemies. The hostility was real. They burned each other's flags, raided each other's cabins, vandalized each other's belongings. They fought, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. They believed in the conflict they had created. But what happened next was even more revealing. The researchers, watching from behind the scenes, had created the division. Now, they needed to see if it could be undone. First, they tried simple contact. They brought the 2 groups together, hoping that exposure alone would break the hostility. It didn't. The boys still saw each other as rivals. They still refused to work together, still carried the resentment from the battles they had fought. So the researchers introduced something else, a shared crisis, a problem neither group could solve alone. The camp's water supply was suddenly cut off. If they wanted water, they would have to work together to find the source of the issue, and something shifted. The rivalry did not disappear instantly, but it cracked. They had no choice but to rely on each other. More obstacles followed, a broken-down truck that needed all their strength to push, a challenge that forced them to pool their money together to watch a movie. Each time, the line between rattlers and eagles faded a little more. By the end of the experiment, they were no longer separate teams. They were one group. The Robbers' Cave experiment was not just about competition. It was about identity, about how easily people divide themselves, how quickly they form alliances, how natural it is to create an us and a them. The boys did not hate each other because of who they were. They hated each other because the situation made them believe they had to. It was also about something else, about how division can be undone, not by words, not by forced contact, but by shared purpose, by something greater than rivalry, by the realization that no matter how deep the conflict, there are always problems that require people to stand together. The study became one of the most famous experiments in social psychology, proving how easily groups can be manipulated into conflict, but also how cooperation, real cooperation, can break down even the strongest divisions. The boys left the camp as friends, but what the experiment revealed has never stopped repeating itself in the real world. The bystander effect experiment, a study that exposed something unsettling about human nature, not the cruelty of those who act, but the silence of those who don't. It was not about violence or malice. It was about hesitation, about the moment when people see someone in need and do nothing, about how responsibility can vanish the more it is shared. The experiment was built on a question. Why do people, when surrounded by others, fail to help in emergencies? It was not a theoretical idea. It was real. In 1964, a woman named Kitty Genovese was murdered in New York City. The attack lasted for over 30 minutes. Witnesses heard it happen. Some saw it, but no one stepped in. No one called the police until it was too late. The story spread, shocking the public, raising questions that had no easy answers. How could so many people watch and do nothing? Psychologists John Darley and Bibb Latané wanted to understand. They set up a series of experiments designed to test when and why people help or fail to. The setup was simple. Participants were told they were part of a study on communication. Each was placed in a room alone, wearing headphones, speaking through an intercom system with what they believed were other participants in separate rooms. At some point in the conversation, one of the voices, the voice of a fellow participant, began to sound distressed. Their words slurred. They gasped for air. They said they were having a seizure. They begged for help, then silence. The participants did not know that the voice was pre-recorded, that there was no real emergency, but their reactions were, if they believed they were the only person hearing the emergency, the response was immediate. Nearly every participant rushed to get help. They saw the situation as their responsibility. There was no one else. It was up to them. But when participants believed there were others who also heard the emergency, something changed. They hesitated. They waited. Some did nothing at all. The more people they believed were listening, the less likely they were to act. It was not indifference. It was not lack of concern. It was something else, something called diffusion of responsibility, a phenomenon where the presence of others makes people feel less personally responsible for acting. They assumed someone else would step in. Someone else would make the call. someone else would do what needed to be done. And when everyone assumes that, no one acts. The findings were undeniable. The more bystanders, the lower the chance of intervention. It explained not just the tragedy of Kitty Genovese, but countless other moments in history, in everyday life, where people witnessed suffering and failed to respond. It was not that they didn't care. It was that they did not feel individually responsible. The experiment did not stop there. In later variations, the researchers found ways to break the effect: eye contact, direct requests, a single voice calling out one person instead of the crowd. When people were personally addressed, when they could not blend into the background, could not assume someone else would take charge, the hesitation faded. They stepped in. They helped. The bystander effect experiment did more than explain inaction. It exposed the fragility of human morality under social pressure. It showed that sometimes the difference between doing something and doing nothing is as simple as believing you are the only one who can. And in the end it left a question, not just for psychology, but for everyone. In an emergency, surrounded by others, would you step forward, or would you wait for someone else to? The car crash experiment. A study that proved memory is not a perfect recording, not an objective truth, but something malleable, something fragile, something that can be rewritten without us even realizing it. It was not about deception. It was about suggestion, about how the way a question is asked can change the way a person remembers an event, turning certainty into something unreliable. In 1974, psychologists Elizabeth Loftus and John Palmer set out to test a simple idea: can the language used to describe an event alter a person's memory of it? They brought participants into a lab, showed them short clips of car accidents, and then asked them a question. But not everyone was asked the same question. Some were asked about how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other. Others were asked the same question, but with different verbs: collided, bumped, hit, contacted. Each word carried weight, a subtle difference in intensity. The results were striking. The participants' answers changed based on the word used. Those who were asked with the word smashed estimated higher speeds. Those given the word contacted estimated lower speeds. The memory of the crash itself had not changed. The video was the same, but the way it was described altered how the participants recalled it. The experiment did not stop there. A week later, the researchers followed up. They asked participants if they remembered seeing broken glass in the crash scene. There was no broken glass in the footage, but those who had been asked using the word smashed were more likely to say yes. The implications were unsettling. It meant that memory is not just a playback of the past. It can be shaped, distorted, rewritten. A simple word, a subtle suggestion, could introduce details that never existed. The mind fills in the gaps, not with fact, but with expectation, with assumption, with the details that seem like they should be there. It went beyond car crashes. The study opened doors to understanding how eyewitness testimony can be unreliable, how leading questions in police interrogations can implant false memories, how media coverage and the way events are framed can alter public perception. It showed that the human mind is not a camera capturing an exact image of reality. It is a story being written and rewritten every time we recall it. The car crash experiment was a warning. It proved that certainty is not always truth, that memory can be manipulated, that what we think we know about the past may not always be what really happened. And it left a question: if memory is so easily altered, how much of what we believe to be true is real, and how much is just a story we've been told? The Monster Study, a name that sounds like fiction, like something out of a horror story, but it was real. It was not about monsters in the traditional sense. It was about words, about the weight they carry, about how they can shape a person's identity without them realizing it. It was a study that never should have happened, an experiment that left scars far deeper than the researchers ever intended. In 1939, Wendell Johnson, a speech pathologist at the University of Iowa, wanted to test an idea. He believed that stuttering wasn't just something a person was born with. It could be created. It could be implanted, reinforced, nurtured into existence. And so the experiment began. 22 orphans were chosen as test subjects. Half were placed in a control group, half in an experimental group. They were not told they were part of a study. They were just children, vulnerable, unaware that their lives were about to be changed. For the control group, the children were encouraged, praised for their speech, told they were speaking well. They were made to feel confident, assured, comfortable in the way they expressed themselves. But the other group, the experimental group, received something very different. They were criticized, told they had a speech problem, that their words were wrong, that they stuttered, even if they didn't. The researchers picked apart their speech, pointed out normal hesitations as mistakes, made them hyper-aware of every sound they made. The children, who had never struggled with speaking before, began to doubt themselves. They hesitated. They became anxious, afraid of saying the wrong thing. They began to stutter. The study was never published. The ethical implications were too severe, the consequences too damaging, but the effects remained. Some of the children from the experimental group carried the speech issues with them into adulthood. Some never recovered. A few became withdrawn, self-conscious, reluctant to speak in public. The damage was done, and it could not be undone. The monster study was a warning, not just about stuttering, but about the power of words. It showed that the way we speak to others can shape them in ways we don't anticipate, that a single comment, a single moment of doubt, can grow into something permanent, that when people are told something about themselves enough times, they begin to believe it, even if it was never true to begin with. The name Monster Study was not given by its creator, but by those who later examined its methods, its ethics, its impact. It was a study that crossed lines, that manipulated children, that inflicted harm in the pursuit of knowledge. It was a reminder of how fragile the human mind can be, especially in its early years, and how easily a belief, true or false, can become reality when it is repeated enough. And it left behind a simple, unsettling truth. Words can build, words can destroy, and sometimes the most lasting wounds are the ones that cannot be seen. The Little Albert Experiment, a study that began with curiosity, with a question about human behavior, about the roots of fear, about whether emotions could be shaped as easily as habits. It was not conducted in secrecy, not hidden away in a dark lab. It was done in plain sight, in the name of science, without ever considering the weight of what was being done to the child at its center. In 1920, psychologist John B. Watson and his assistant Rosalie Reimer set out to prove something. They believed that fear was not something people were born with. It was something that could be conditioned, something that could be taught. They wanted to show that a person's emotional reactions were not fixed, that they could be shaped, molded, manipulated, like any other learned behavior. The subject of the experiment was a baby, an orphan known only as Little Albert. He was chosen because he was healthy, because he showed no initial signs of fear, because he was a blank slate. Watson saw him not as a child, but as a test subject, a means to an end. And so the experiment began. At first, Albert was introduced to a series of objects, things he had no reason to fear: a white rat, A rabbit, a dog, a mask. He reached for them without hesitation, touched them with curiosity, played with them as any child would. He was not afraid, not yet. Then the conditioning started. Each time Albert reached for the white rat, Watson struck a metal bar behind him with a hammer. The sound was sudden, sharp, overwhelming. Albert cried, startled by the noise, but it did not stop. Again and again he reached for the rat, and again the crash of the metal rang out behind him. He began to associate the two, the rat and the noise, the sight of the animal, and the fear that followed. It didn't take long. Soon Albert no longer needed the sound. He saw the rat, and reacted with fear, with distress, with the expectation of something terrible. But it didn't stop there. The fear spread. Albert began reacting the same way to anything that resembled the rat, the rabbit, the dog, even a fur coat. His fear was no longer about the noise. It had attached itself to anything white and furry, anything that reminded him of the thing he had been taught to fear. The experiment was meant to prove a point, and it did. It showed that fear could be conditioned, that emotions were not fixed, that a person's reactions to the world could be shaped without them realizing it. But what Watson failed to consider, or perhaps refused to acknowledge, was what it meant for Albert himself. The child was never deconditioned. The fear that had been implanted in him was left there. The study ended, and Albert was taken away, his future unknown. There was no follow-up, no attempt to undo the effects, no concern for what had been done to him. He was an experiment, and when the experiment was over, so was the interest in his well-being. Years later, researchers tried to track down Albert's identity, to find out what happened to him. Some believe he died at a young age from illness. Others believe he lived his life unaware of the role he played in psychological history. No one truly knows whether he carried the fear with him, whether the conditioning lasted beyond the lab, whether the associations created in that experiment shaped the way he saw the world for the rest of his life. The little Albert experiment became infamous, not just for what it proved, but for what it represented: the ethical failures of early psychology, the willingness to use human subjects without regard for their well-being, the idea that knowledge could justify harm. It revealed something undeniable about the way humans learn, about how fears are formed, about how the mind can be shaped in ways that are not always visible. It laid the foundation for behaviorism, for the study of learned responses, for the understanding of how conditioning affects emotions. But it also left behind a question: if fear can be created so easily, if a single experience can alter the way a person sees the world, how many of our fears are truly our own, and how many were given to us? The Tuskegee syphilis study, a study that did not begin in secrecy, but in full view of the public, a study that lasted for 40 years, not in the shadows, but in the hands of doctors, researchers, and government officials who knew exactly what they were doing. It was not an experiment designed to heal. It was an experiment designed to observe, and in doing so it became one of the most infamous violations of medical ethics in history. In 1932, the U.S. Public Health Service, working with the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, launched a study to examine the long-term effects of untreated syphilis. The subjects were 600 black men, 399 who had syphilis, and 201 who did not. They were poor sharecroppers, many of them illiterate, many of them trusting the doctors who told them they were being treated for bad blood. They were never told they had syphilis. They were never told the true purpose of the study. There was no treatment. There was never supposed to be. The study was designed to watch the disease progress, to track its effects on the body over time, to see how it ravaged the nervous system, the heart, the brain. The men were given placebos, sham treatments that did nothing to stop the infection. They were monitored, examined, studied, but they were never cured. And then in 1947, something happened. Penicillin was discovered, a treatment that could have stopped the disease, saved lives, reversed the damage. But the men in the Tuskegee study were not given penicillin. The doctors deliberately withheld it. They watched as the disease advanced, as men went blind, as their organs failed, as they suffered. The study continued. Decades passed. The men grew older. Some died from syphilis. Others unknowingly passed it to their wives, to their children. The researchers knew, and they did nothing. The study was never meant to be exposed, but in 1972, a whistleblower leaked the details to the press. The public outrage was immediate. The study was shut down. Investigations followed. Lawsuits were filed. The government issued an apology 25 years later. By the time the truth came out, many of the men were already dead. Their families were left with the weight of what had been done to them, the knowledge that their suffering had been preventable, that they had been used, lied to, discarded. The Tuskegee syphilis study was not a mistake. It was not an accident. It was a choice, made by doctors, scientists, officials who believed that knowledge was more valuable than the lives of the men they studied. It was a reminder that ethics are not just guidelines, that human lives cannot be treated as disposable, that the pursuit of science without morality is a dangerous thing. It left behind more than just its victims. It left behind distrust, a deep, lasting skepticism of the medical system, of government health programs, of the idea that doctors always have the best interests of their patients in mind. The echoes of that distrust still exist today, in communities that remember what happened, in people who question whether history could repeat itself, and it forced a question that science has never fully answered. How many lives are worth sacrificing for the sake of knowledge, and who gets to decide? The Guatemala Syphilis Experiment, a study that was never meant to be known, a secret buried for decades, hidden away in government archives, left out of history books. It was not an experiment of observation, not a study of untreated disease like Tuskegee. It was something worse, something deliberate, something intentional. It was not just withholding treatment. It was infecting people without their knowledge, without their consent, without any regard for their lives. Between 1946 and 1948, the United States Public Health Service, with funding from the National Institutes of Health and cooperation from Guatemalan officials, carried out one of the most unethical medical experiments in history. It was designed to study sexually transmitted infections, to test treatments, to understand how syphilis, gonorrhea, and chancroid could be prevented. But instead of finding people who already had these diseases, the researchers created their own test subjects. They targeted the most vulnerable: prisoners, mental hospital patients, soldiers, sex workers, people with no power, no voice, no way to refuse what was being done to them. The researchers deliberately exposed them to infections, sometimes through sexual contact, sometimes by directly applying the bacteria to their bodies, sometimes by injecting it into their bloodstreams. There was no informed consent. The subjects had no idea what was happening. They were told they were receiving routine medical care. They were given false explanations. They were not given the choice to say no. Some were treated with penicillin, but not all. Some were left to suffer as the disease took hold, as it spread through their bodies, as it destroyed their nervous systems, their organs, their minds. Some were not even properly monitored, just infected and abandoned, their suffering recorded in notebooks, but never eased. The experiment ended in 1948, not because of ethical concerns, not because anyone stepped in to stop it. It ended because the funding ran out. The records were filed away. The participants were forgotten. For over 60 years, no one knew. There was no public outrage, no scandal, no headlines. The victims continued living, or dying, never understanding what had been done to them. Then in 2010, historian Susan Reverby uncovered the documents. She had been researching the Tuskegee syphilis study, looking through government records, when she found something unexpected: a hidden history, a secret study, evidence of crimes no one had ever been held accountable for. The revelation was explosive. The U.S. government was forced to acknowledge what had happened. President Obama personally apologized to Guatemala, calling the experiment clearly unethical. Investigations were launched. Lawsuits were filed, but no real justice could be given. The victims were long gone. The damage had been done. The Guatemala syphilis experiment was not just an example of unethical science. It was a violation of basic human dignity, a reminder of what happens when people in power believe they have the right to use others as test subjects, as data points, as disposable. It exposed the darkest side of medical research, the side where knowledge is pursued without limits, where human suffering becomes secondary to the goals of those who see themselves as above morality. It forced a question that still lingers. How many other experiments, buried in classified documents, have yet to be uncovered? How many people have been used in the name of science, without their knowledge? And how do we ensure that history does not repeat itself when so many of its worst offenses were never meant to be known? The Russian sleep experiment, a story passed around in dark corners of the internet, a tale that lingers in the back of the mind long after it is heard. It is not part of official history, not recorded in medical journals, not confirmed by any government, but it persists. A myth, perhaps. A fabrication, possibly, but the fear it provokes, the ideas it raises, the questions it forces people to ask, those are real. The story goes like this. In the late 1940s, Soviet researchers conducted a secret experiment on human sleep deprivation. 5 political prisoners were chosen as subjects, locked in a sealed chamber and exposed to a specially designed gas that would prevent them from sleeping. They were told they would be freed if they could stay awake for 30 days. The first few days were uneventful. The subjects conversed, whispered among themselves, paced the room. Their movements were monitored, their oxygen intake measured, their words recorded. The researchers observed from behind thick glass, taking notes, waiting for signs of deterioration. By the 5th day, things began to change. The conversations grew darker, more paranoid. The subjects spoke less, stared into the corners of the room as if seeing things that weren't there. The researchers took it as a sign of mental strain, expected under the circumstances, but what happened next was not expected. By the 9th day, the first screams were heard. One of the subjects began running back and forth across the room, shrieking until his voice gave out. The others remained silent, not reacting, not acknowledging him, just staring. Then came the whispering, low and frantic, too quiet for the researchers to make out. Then silence. Days passed with no communication. The microphones picked up only faint movements, the occasional rustling of fabric, the steady breathing of the remaining subjects. The researchers debated what to do. They had not designed the experiment for this. Finally, on the 15th day, they made a decision. They turned off the gas. For the first time in over 2 weeks, fresh air flooded into the chamber. The researchers expected cries of relief, desperate pleas to be let out. Instead, they heard something that made their blood run cold. A single voice from the darkness. We no longer want to be free. What they found inside was worse than anything they had imagined. The walls were smeared with blood. The subjects had mutilated themselves, torn at their own flesh, pulled out their own intestines with bare hands. One was dead. The others had carved themselves open, but showed no sign of pain. They barely reacted when the researchers entered. When the guards moved in to remove them, the subjects fought back with unnatural strength. They tore through the men with inhuman ferocity, their bodies ignoring wounds that should have killed them. It took sedation, brute force to drag them out of the chamber. But even under heavy sedation, even strapped to tables with restraints, they whispered. They whispered about something waiting inside them, something that had always been there, hidden beneath sleep, buried under dreams. The gas had not created it. It had only removed the barrier keeping it at bay. One subject, the last conscious one, looked a researcher in the eye and spoke before his heart finally stopped. "We are you." The story ends there. No official records, no confirmation, just a tale spread through forums, horror sites, urban legends. People debate whether it ever happened. Some dismiss it as fiction. Others claim it is based on something real, distorted over time, exaggerated, reshaped by fear and imagination. But that is what makes it unsettling. It does not matter if it was real. It does not matter if the experiment ever took place. The idea remains. The fear lingers. What happens when the mind is pushed beyond its limits? What parts of ourselves do we never truly see? And if sleep is what keeps them hidden, what happens when it is taken away? MK Experiments, a program buried under layers of secrecy, deception, and deliberate destruction of evidence. A government operation so shocking that when the truth finally emerged, it sounded less like reality and more like the plot of a conspiracy theory. But it was real. It happened, and its effects stretched far beyond what was ever officially admitted. In the early 1950s, at the height of the Cold War, the United States was obsessed with one thing: control. The world was divided into two sides, and intelligence agencies were in a race, not just for weapons, but for minds. The fear was that the Soviets, the Chinese, the North Koreans, had discovered methods of psychological manipulation, ways to break a person's will, ways to control thoughts, erase memories, create obedience. The CIA wanted to catch up. They wanted an edge, and so Project MK was born. Officially, it was a study on mind control. Unofficially, it became one of the most disturbing government experiments in modern history. The project, led by Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, was vast, spanning over 80 institutions, including universities, hospitals, prisons, and military bases. The experiments had one goal: to find ways to manipulate and control human behavior. The methods were extreme. Subjects were exposed to high doses of LSD without their knowledge. They were hypnotized, deprived of sleep, subjected to electroshock therapy, isolated for long periods of time. Some were pushed to their psychological breaking points. Some never recovered. Many of the test subjects had no idea they were part of an experiment. They were civilians, prisoners, military personnel, psychiatric patients. Some were drugged in bars and restaurants, then taken to hidden locations for observation. Some were unwitting volunteers, signing up for studies on mental health or memory improvement, never realizing what they had actually agreed to. Others were simply victims, people the CIA considered expendable. The experiments went beyond drugging and observation. There were attempts to wipe memories, to implant false ones, to create unwitting assassins who could be triggered by a phrase, a sound, a command. The CIA was searching for the ability to control people completely, to turn them into tools that could be activated without their knowledge. Some of these efforts were crude, ineffective. Others were terrifyingly close to success. One of the most notorious programs within MK Ultra was Operation Midnight Climax. In this operation, CIA-funded brothels were set up in San Francisco and New York. Prostitutes, under agency orders, lured unsuspecting men inside, where they were given drinks laced with LSD. Hidden cameras recorded everything, As the men were observed for hours, their reactions studied, their minds toyed with. The experiments continued for decades, unchecked, unregulated. There was no oversight. The people running the program had full control, and they used it to push further and further into ethically and legally questionable territory. Some test subjects died, some were institutionalized for the rest of their lives, others simply disappeared. Then in 1973, the CIA panicked. The Watergate scandal had exposed the government's willingness to cover up illegal activities, and agency officials knew that if MK Ultra came to light, the fallout would be catastrophic. Under orders, thousands of documents related to the program were destroyed. What remained was a fragment of what had truly happened, enough to hint at the scope of the program, but not enough to ever uncover its full extent. But some evidence survived. In 1975, the Church Committee and the Rockefeller Commission brought MK Ultra into the public eye. What they found was damning. Testimonies from former subjects described psychological torture, ruined lives, irreversible trauma. The government was forced to acknowledge what had happened. Lawsuits followed, apologies were issued, but the damage had already been done. Even now, the full scope of MK Ultra remains unknown. Too much was destroyed, too much was buried, but its legacy is undeniable. It confirmed that governments are willing to experiment on their own citizens, that the search for control often comes at the expense of ethics, that sometimes the truth is stranger and darker than fiction. And it left behind a chilling question. If these experiments were happening in secret for decades, what else has been done that we still don't know about? Operation Midnight Climax. A name that sounds like fiction, like something out of a crime novel, but it was real. A secret CIA program that blurred the line between espionage, psychological experimentation, and outright criminal activity. It was not about intelligence gathering in the traditional sense. It was about manipulation, about control, about testing the limits of human behavior in ways that were never meant to be seen by the public. It began in the early 1950s, in the heart of the Cold War, when the United States government believed it was in a silent war, not just of weapons, but of minds. The fear was that the Soviets, the Chinese, and the North Koreans had developed techniques for brainwashing, for mind control, for chemically altering behavior. The CIA wanted an edge. They wanted a way to influence people without them realizing it, a way to manipulate without detection. This was the mindset that gave birth to MK Ultra, and within it, one of the most notorious sub-projects, Operation Midnight Climax. The goal was simple. The execution was not. The agency needed a way to test how drugs, particularly LSD, could be used to extract information from people without their consent. Could it make them more vulnerable to interrogation? Could it alter their personalities? Could it make them easier to control? The only way to find out was to test it, and for that they needed subjects. They chose the perfect targets, people who would never report what had happened, people who wouldn't be believed even if they did. CIA-backed brothels were set up in San Francisco and New York, disguised as seedy establishments, catering to men looking for a good time. They were stocked with prostitutes who had been secretly recruited by the agency, trained to lure in unsuspecting men, and paid to administer drug-laced drinks. The customers had no idea what they were walking into. They thought they were paying for a night of pleasure. What they got was something else entirely. Behind two-way mirrors, CIA operatives watched, took notes, recorded everything. The men were studied as they slipped into altered states, as the effects of the drugs took hold, as they revealed secrets they didn't even know they had. The agents observed how the men reacted to different doses, how their inhibitions dissolved, how their paranoia grew. Some became confused, frightened, paranoid. Others laughed uncontrollably, babbled, lost all sense of reality. The program was run under the command of Sidney Gottlieb, the head of MK Ultra, but the field operations were led by George Hunter White, a former federal narcotics officer, with no hesitation about using illegal methods for government ends. White thrived in this environment. He was not a scientist, not a psychologist. He was an enforcer, a man who believed in results, in pushing the limits, in testing theories in the real world. He decorated the brothels with lurid paintings, staged them like scenes from a noir film, turned them into places where morality did not apply. He described his work with an almost gleeful detachment, later writing in his notes, "Where else could a red-blooded American boy lie, kill, cheat, steal, rape, and pillage with the sanction and blessing of the All-Highest?" The men who were drugged never knew what had happened. Some woke up in alleys, some stumbled home in confusion, some never realized they had been part of an experiment at all. They were chosen because they were disposable in the eyes of the agency. Drifters, addicts, criminals, men who had secrets of their own, and would never dare go to the police. But the program didn't stop there. The CIA began expanding its methods, experimenting with how LSD could be used in other covert operations. Agents dosed each other in offices, in restaurants, in secret meetings, testing the drug on their own people without warning. The idea was to create a weapon, something that could be slipped into an enemy's drink, something that could make foreign leaders unravel in public, something that could turn a target into an unwitting pawn. The results were mixed. LSD was unpredictable. Some subjects became more talkative, more open. Others became uncontrollable, erratic, dangerous. The agency never found the magic formula they were looking for, but that didn't stop them from trying. Operation Midnight Climax ran for over a decade before it was quietly shut down. No one was ever held accountable, no apologies were issued. The entire project was buried under layers of classified documents, protected by the same institutions that had authorized it in the first place. It was only decades later, through congressional hearings and whistleblowers, that the truth began to surface. By then the damage had already been done. The program left behind a legacy of mistrust, a reminder that the government was willing to drug its own citizens in the name of research, that the people sworn to protect national security had no hesitation about violating basic human rights. Operation Midnight Climax was not about science. It was not about defense. It was about power, the ability to control without consent, to experiment without accountability, to push the limits of morality under the cover of secrecy. And it left behind a simple, unsettling truth. If they were willing to do this, what else were they willing to do? The Pit of Despair, a name that sounds like it belongs in a horror novel, but it was real. A psychological experiment designed not just to study suffering, but to create it. A study that went beyond observation and into something darker, something that left scars, not only on its subjects, but on the very field of psychology itself. It began in the 1970s with one man, Harry Harlow, a psychologist already known for controversial work. Harlow had spent years studying love, attachment, and maternal bonds in primates. He had shown how infant monkeys, when separated from their mothers, clung to soft inanimate objects for comfort, proving that love was not just about survival, it was about emotional connection. But this time, his work took a different turn. This time, he wasn't interested in love. He was interested in what happened when love was taken away. He wanted to study depression, not just sadness, not just temporary distress, but true, deep, all-consuming despair. And to do that, he needed a way to break a mind. He built a device for that purpose, a small enclosed metal box with smooth sides, designed so the occupant had nothing to hold onto, nothing to grasp for comfort. He called it a vertical chamber, but his colleagues called it something else, the Pit of Despair. Into these chambers, he placed infant rhesus monkeys, Some had already formed attachments with their mothers, others had been raised in relative isolation, but once inside the pit, none of that mattered. The walls were too high to climb. There was nothing but darkness, and their own reflection. At first, the monkeys tried. They screamed, they cried, they searched for a way out, but as the hours passed, the energy drained from them. They stopped moving, stopped reacting, stopped eating. The fight left their bodies, and in its place was something else, something empty, something broken. The longer they stayed in the pit, the worse it got. Some monkeys were kept inside for days, others for weeks. By the time they were removed, they were no longer the same. They sat motionless in the corners of their cages, refusing to interact with others, barely acknowledging their surroundings. Some never recovered. Some lost the ability to bond, to play, to show interest in anything. Others turned violent, lashing out at anything that came near them. The results were undeniable. The pit of despair worked. It created deep, lasting psychological damage. It proved that social creatures, when deprived of love and connection, did not just become lonely. They became something else, something broken, something lost. But what it proved came at a cost. Even among researchers, Harlow's work was seen as extreme, as unethical, as pushing the boundaries of what science should allow. His defenders argued that his studies provided insight into depression, that they showed the devastating effects of isolation, that they highlighted the importance of love and companionship. But his critics saw something else. They saw suffering inflicted not for treatment, not for healing, but for knowledge alone. They saw an experiment that did not just observe despair, but actively created it. The pit of despair became one of the most infamous studies in psychology. It forced a conversation about ethics, about the responsibility of researchers, about how far science should go in the pursuit of understanding. Harlow himself never seemed to question what he had done. To him, the results were more important than the methods. But the legacy of his work was not just in the data he collected. It was in the lasting impact it had on psychology, on ethics, on the way research is conducted. His work contributed to stricter regulations on animal testing, to new debates about the moral limits of experimentation, to a deeper awareness of the cost of knowledge. But the lesson of the pit of despair was not just about science. It was about isolation itself. It showed that being alone is not just a condition, it is a force that can break the mind, that can strip away the very things that make a creature whole. It showed that love, connection, and social bonds are not just luxuries, they are necessities. And it left behind a simple, haunting question: if isolation can do this to a monkey, what does it do to us? The Homunculus Experiment, a name that sounds like something from forgotten alchemy, something from ancient texts that spoke of creating life from nothing. That this was no legend, no medieval pursuit of artificial beings. It was real, it was modern, and it was one of the most unsettling studies of the human brain ever attempted. It began in the 1950s, during a time when neuroscience was still in its infancy, when the human mind was a mystery waiting to be mapped. Scientists were fascinated by the question of perception, how the brain interprets the body, how it constructs the reality of touch, pressure, pain. But one man, Dr. Wilder Penfield, wanted to go deeper. He wanted to find out exactly how the brain sees itself. He conducted a series of experiments that would later be called the Homunculus Experiment, though it was never officially labeled that way. His subjects were awake, fully conscious, their skulls opened, their brains exposed. It was the only way to get the answers he wanted. Using a small electrode, he stimulated different regions of the brain's sensory cortex, a slight electric current, just enough to trigger a response, and as he moved the electrode across different areas, something remarkable happened. The patients reported sensations, not in their brains, but in their bodies, a touch on the face, a tingling in the fingertips, a pressure on the toes. Bit by bit, he built a map, revealing something astonishing. The brain was not wired to the body in a neat, proportional way. Instead, it distorted reality. Certain areas, like the hands, the lips, the tongue, were massively overrepresented, while others like the torso, the arms, the legs, were reduced to almost nothing. The result was a grotesque, exaggerated figure, a human form built not on anatomy, but on perception. It had massive hands, huge lips, an enormous tongue, and tiny shrunken limbs. It was not the body as it existed, it was the body as the brain experienced it. A warped, sensory-driven version of the self, the homunculus. The implications were profound. It meant that the way we feel our bodies is not an objective truth. It is a construction, shaped by the way our brains prioritize sensation. It explained why injuries in certain areas, like the hands or mouth, feel more intense than in others. It explained why some parts of the body seem hypersensitive, while others feel almost numb. But it also raised deeper questions. If the body we experience is not the body we have, then how much of our perception is real? How much of what we take for granted, our sense of self, our awareness of where we begin and end, is simply a trick of the brain? Penfield's work did not stop there. His experiments extended beyond sensation into the realm of memory, into the very foundations of consciousness. He found that stimulating certain areas of the brain could trigger long-forgotten memories, moments buried deep in the past, suddenly played back in perfect detail. It was as if the brain was a vast archive, storing everything, even the things we thought were lost forever. His discoveries laid the foundation for modern neuroscience, for our understanding of how the brain constructs reality. But they also left behind something else, a disturbing realization. We do not experience the world as it is. We experience it as our brains tell us it is. And if the brain can be tricked, if its map of the body is warped, if memories can be replayed like recordings, then how much of what we think we know about ourselves is actually true? The floating prison. A name that sounds like something from a dystopian nightmare. A place where time has no meaning, where the outside world is nothing but a memory. But this was no fiction. It was real. A government experiment, hidden under the guise of national security. A test of endurance, control, and psychological decay. It began in 1954, in the early years of the Cold War, when fear and paranoia ruled the decisions of world governments. The United States was desperate to understand the limits of human endurance, particularly in captivity. They needed to know how long a person could last under extreme isolation, how the mind would break when stripped of all normalcy, how interrogation methods could be pushed to their limits. So they created the perfect environment for it. A floating prison, far from land, beyond the reach of oversight, a ship disguised as a simple military vessel, but inside, it was something else entirely. It was a place where men were taken, not for crimes they had committed, but for what they might know. A place where prisoners disappeared, where records of their existence faded, where they were no longer people, but subjects in an experiment no one would ever admit existed. The prisoners were a mix of suspected spies, political dissidents, and men who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Some were taken from foreign countries, others were American citizens, their fates sealed by accusations that needed no proof. They were transported in secrecy, blindfolded, shackled, stripped of their identities. Once aboard, They were locked away in solitary cells, small windowless spaces barely large enough to lie down in. The walls were metal, featureless, unyielding. There was no natural light, no sense of time. Food was given at irregular intervals. Sleep was never allowed to settle into a rhythm. The only sound was the distant hum of the ship's engines, the occasional footsteps of unseen guards, the slow, maddening creak of the ship rocking against the waves. Days passed, then weeks. Some prisoners held out, clinging to whatever scraps of sanity they had left. Others began to break. Their minds, deprived of stimulation, turned inward. Some spoke to themselves. Others screamed into the darkness, begging for release. A few simply stopped speaking altogether, retreating into a silence so deep that nothing could pull them back. The ship moved constantly, never staying in one place long enough to be noticed. When it docked, it was in places where no questions would be asked, where those in charge could step off for a brief respite before returning to their floating laboratory. And all the while, the prisoners remained in their cells, waiting for something: release, death, an end to the endless days that stretched on without meaning. The experiment was not just about endurance, it was about control. Guards tested different methods of psychological manipulation: sensory deprivation, disorientation, misinformation. Some prisoners were told they would be freed if they cooperated, only to have their hopes crushed again and again. Others were forced to listen to loops of whispered voices, messages meant to break their will, their sense of self. Some resisted, others succumbed. A few lost themselves completely. When they were no longer useful, they were removed. Some were returned to their home countries, broken shadows of the men they had once been. Others simply vanished, their names erased, their fates unknown. The floating prison was never officially acknowledged. No documents were ever released, no records confirmed. It existed in the spaces between classified files, in the testimonies of those who spoke in whispers, in the fragments of reports that hinted at something too dark to be admitted. But its legacy remained. It proved what those in power had long suspected, that the human mind, when stripped of all control, will unravel, that isolation is not just a condition, but a weapon, that when a person is deprived of everything, freedom, time, light, hope, they do not just suffer, they change. And it left behind a question that has never been answered: how many people were lost to the waves, forgotten not by accident, but by design? The Elephant on LSD, a study that sounds like a joke, a bizarre headline pulled from the depths of a forgotten newspaper. But it was real. It was science, pushed beyond reason, a moment where curiosity and recklessness collided, leaving behind only confusion and regret. It happened in 1962, in the city of Oklahoma. A team of researchers from the University of Oklahoma, led by Dr. Louis Jolyon West, set out to answer a question no one had thought to ask: how would an elephant react to LSD? It was not part of a grand psychological study. It was not designed to uncover deep truths about consciousness or perception. It was curiosity, plain and simple, a test to see if the world's largest land animal could experience the same hallucinatory effects that humans did. The subject was an elephant named Tuskegee, a massive bull elephant living at the Oklahoma City Zoo. He was strong, healthy, unaware that he was about to become part of an experiment that would go down as one of the strangest in scientific history. The researchers had a theory. In nature, male elephants occasionally enter a state called must, a period of heightened aggression where testosterone levels spike, leading to unpredictable and often violent behavior. The researchers believed that LSD, in the right dose, might be able to artificially trigger this state, but they had no guide to follow, no previous studies to compare, no calculations based on body weight or metabolism. LSD had been tested on humans, on smaller animals, but never on something this large, so they made a guess, and that guess would prove disastrous. They injected Tuskegee with 297 milligrams of LSD, an amount thousands of times larger than what a human would typically take. It was not a gradual dose. It was not monitored or adjusted. It was administered all at once, straight into his bloodstream. At first nothing happened. For a few moments, Tuskegee stood still. Then his body reacted. He let out a violent roar, his massive legs trembling beneath him. His muscles spasmed uncontrollably. His body convulsed. He collapsed to the ground, struggling to breathe, his eyes wide with confusion and fear. The researchers watched in shock. This was not what they had expected. Panic set in. The scientists scrambled to reverse what they had done. They injected him with a massive dose of thorazine, an antipsychotic used to treat humans experiencing extreme LSD reactions. Then they gave him pentobarbital, a powerful sedative. It was too late. Tuskegee's body twitched one final time. Then he went still. The largest dose of LSD ever given to a living creature had killed him in minutes. The researchers were left with nothing but a dead elephant and a series of unanswered questions. Had the LSD itself killed him? Had it triggered a seizure? Had the combination of drugs sent his body into shock? Or had they simply miscalculated, giving him a dose that no living thing could survive? The results were inconclusive. The experiment, if it could even be called that, was a failure. It proved nothing, except that reckless science had consequences. It did not advance knowledge, did not explain, must. It did not contribute anything to the field of psychology or neuroscience. It was a moment of blind curiosity that had ended in tragedy. Years later, some researchers revisited the case, suggesting that LSD alone was unlikely to have been fatal. They theorized that the extreme dose, combined with the shock to his system and the rapid counter-drugs, had created the perfect storm of biological failure. That the truth would never be known. Tuskegee had become the unintended victim of an experiment that never should have happened, and his death became a lasting reminder that not all questions are worth answering. It left behind a single uncomfortable realization. Science is driven by curiosity, by the pursuit of knowledge, by the desire to understand the unknown. But when that curiosity is unchecked, when the pursuit of answers ignores caution, ethics, and responsibility, it is not knowledge that is gained, it is regret. Project 4.1. A name that sounds like nothing. A number, a classification, a piece of bureaucratic language buried in government documents. But behind that name was something else. An experiment that was never called an experiment. A study that was never meant to be acknowledged. A moment in history when an entire population became test subjects without their knowledge or consent. It began on March 1st, 1954, with Castle Bravo, the largest nuclear test ever conducted by the United States. A hydrogen bomb detonated in the remote Bikini Atoll in the Marshall Islands, releasing an explosion more than 1,000 times the power of the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The test was supposed to be controlled, contained, predictable, but it wasn't. The explosion was far stronger than expected. The fireball expanded faster than calculations had predicted, and the radioactive fallout spread far beyond the intended zone. White ash rained from the sky. It coated the land, the water, the people. The residents of Rongelup, Alenia, and Uterik, small islands, downwind of the test site, watched as their world changed in an instant. They did not know what it was. They did not know what it meant. But their skin burned. Their hair fell out. Their bodies absorbed radiation in ways no human should ever experience. They had not been warned. They had not been evacuated. And when the US government arrived, it was not to rescue them. It was to study them. Project 4.1 was classified as a study of human exposure to fallout radiation. But it was more than a study. It was an observation of suffering. The Marshallese people, now poisoned by radioactive dust, were monitored, examined, documented. Blood samples were taken, symptoms were recorded. Scientists watched as the effects unfolded: acute radiation sickness, burns, nausea, vomiting. Then over the years something worse: cancers, birth defects, thyroid disorders, miscarriages. The damage did not fade. It grew. It spread through generations. And all the while, the United States continued its nuclear testing, detonating 67 nuclear bombs in the Marshall Islands between 1946 and 1958. Some of the tests were conducted, knowing full well that fallout would drift toward inhabited areas. For decades, the truth was hidden. The residents were told that they had been accidentally exposed, that they were being treated, that they were victims of an unfortunate miscalculation. But the documents told a different story. They revealed that Project 4.1 was not launched after the radiation exposure. It had been planned before the Castle Bravo test even took place. The government had already decided to study the effects of nuclear fallout on human beings. The Marshallese were not just victims. They were subjects. The consequences lasted long beyond the bomb. Generations were affected. Lands that had once been home became uninhabitable. The people of the Marshall Islands were relocated, displaced, forced into exile from the land their ancestors had lived on for centuries. And for years, they were given conflicting information, partial truths, half apologies. It was only decades later that the full extent of the damage became undeniable. In 1994, a declassified U.S. government report confirmed what many had long suspected. Project 4.1 was not an accident. It was a deliberate study of the effects of radiation on human populations. The Marshallese people had been used as test subjects, their suffering turned into data points, their lives reduced to an experiment. The United States eventually paid financial settlements, issued apologies, acknowledged the horrors of what had happened. But no amount of money could undo the damage. No words could erase what had been done. The radiation had seeped into the bones of those who lived through it. The fear had taken root in their descendants. The legacy of Project 4.1 was not just in medical reports or government documents. It was in the lives that were altered, the lands that were poisoned, the people who were never given a choice. It left behind a chilling realization. Governments do not always protect. Science is not always used for good. And sometimes the greatest harm is not inflicted by an enemy, but by those who claim to be allies. The 11-day Coma Experiment, a study that sounds like something out of a medical thriller, a deliberate decision to push the human brain into the unknown, to see what would happen when consciousness was taken away and then brought back. It was not an accident. It was not a desperate medical intervention. It was an experiment designed to answer a question that had haunted doctors and scientists for years: what happens inside the brain when a person is placed into a coma? In 2005, a team of neuroscientists in Cambridge, England, set out to uncover the mysteries of the unconscious mind. They wanted to know what happened when the brain was shut down, how it processed time, memory, and reality when stripped of awareness. And to do that, they needed a test subject, someone willing to surrender themselves to the unknown. That subject was a 23-year-old man, healthy, fully conscious, prepared to go through something no one had ever intentionally undergone before. He was placed under deep medical sedation, his body slowed to an artificial stillness. Machines took over his breathing. Electrodes were placed on his head, monitoring every flicker of brain activity. For 11 days, he remained in this state, not asleep, not dead, but somewhere in between. The experiment was not just about his body, it was about his mind. Every moment was recorded, mapped through brain scans and electrical activity. The scientists wanted to see whether his brain would behave like that of a coma patient, whether the circuits of consciousness would fade, whether his identity would unravel, whether he would return the same. And then, after 11 days, they brought him back. His body woke up first. His muscles responded. His breathing returned to normal. But his mind, that was something else. He opened his eyes, but he was not truly awake, disoriented, detached, somewhere between reality and whatever existed in that coma state. He was aware, but not fully. The world felt unfamiliar. Time was missing. His memories were intact, but his sense of self had shifted. In the days that followed, the researchers conducted a series of tests. Had his personality changed? Had his emotions been altered? Was he the same person he had been before the experiment? The answers were unclear. His cognitive functions returned, but there were gaps, small fractures in his perception of time and space. He described a sense of distance, a strange awareness that something had happened, but no way to place it. The results of the study were groundbreaking. His brain had not simply shut down, it had adapted. Even in the absence of consciousness, the brain had continued working, forming new pathways, adjusting to its new reality. It had not been empty, it had been active, searching for a way back. But the experiment left behind more than just data. It left behind questions. Had he truly been unconscious, or had some part of him been aware, trapped inside a body that would not move? Had time existed for him, or had those 11 days simply vanished? Had he been nowhere, or had he been somewhere beyond human understanding? The experiment was never repeated. The ethical concerns were too great, the risks too unknown. But the findings changed the way scientists understood coma patients, brain function, and the fragile nature of consciousness itself. It left behind an unsettling realization. The brain is not a machine that simply turns off. It lingers, it waits, it searches, and when it wakes up, it is never quite the same. The Yellow Fever Prison Experiment, a study that tested the limits of human sacrifice, where men were offered a choice: suffer for science, or stay in the darkness of a prison cell. It was an experiment built on desperation, on the willingness of some to endure pain in the hopes of freedom, and on the cold calculations of researchers who believed the price of knowledge was worth the risk. It happened in 1900 in Havana, Cuba, during a time when yellow fever was a mystery that haunted the world. The disease had devastated populations, sweeping through cities with a mortality rate that made it one of the deadliest illnesses of its time. Victims developed fevers, bled from their noses and mouths, suffered organ failure. Many never recovered, but no one knew exactly how it spread. Some believed it was caused by filth, others suspected contaminated water, and then there were those who had another theory, one that would soon be tested in a way that few could imagine. Laid by Dr. Walter Reed, a team of American scientists working for the U.S. Army Yellow Fever Commission set out to prove a radical idea, that yellow fever was not spread through direct contact or poor sanitation, but by mosquito bites. The only way to be sure was to deliberately infect people, and for that they needed volunteers, but not just any volunteers. Prisoners. At a military hospital in Havana, inmates were given an offer: participate in the study, allow themselves to be infected, and in exchange, they would receive $100 in gold, a fortune for the time. If they contracted the disease and survived, they would be given an additional $100 and a certificate of gratitude from the U.S. government, but there was no guarantee of survival. Some prisoners agreed, others refused, unwilling to gamble with their lives for the promise of money and freedom. The ones who accepted were placed in mosquito cages, small enclosed spaces where they were bitten by insects that had already fed on infected yellow fever patients. The scientists watched, took notes, and waited. The symptoms came quickly: fever, vomiting, chills, weakness. Some of the volunteers recovered, some did not. One of the prisoners, who had agreed to the experiment for money, died within days. But the study did not stop there. The researchers wanted to test another theory, that yellow fever could also spread through contaminated clothing and bedding. So they built the infected clothing house, a cabin filled with the sheets and garments of yellow fever patients. Healthy volunteers were asked to sleep in the beds of the dead, to wear the clothes of the sick, to breathe the same air that had surrounded the dying. Not a single one got sick. The conclusion was undeniable. Yellow fever did not spread through physical contact. It did not come from filth or foul air. It came from mosquitoes. The experiment proved that the disease was transmitted by a specific type of mosquito, Aedes aegypti, and that controlling the spread of yellow fever was no longer a matter of sanitation, but of eliminating the insects that carried it. The results changed the world. With this knowledge, mosquito control programs were launched, cities drained swamps, homes were fumigated, and soon yellow fever, once an unstoppable killer, was driven back. The discovery paved the way for vaccines, for treatments, for a future where yellow fever was no longer an unchecked plague. But the cost was real. The prisoners who took part in the experiment had done so out of desperation, out of hope, out of a willingness to risk death for the promise of gold and recognition. Some survived, carrying the scars of what they endured. Others did not. Their names were not remembered. Their sacrifice was not honored. The medical world moved forward, but the men who had been used as test subjects were left behind, their fates known only to history. The yellow fever prison experiment was a moment where the line between scientific progress and human ethics blurred. It proved that knowledge could save lives, but it also proved that science, when left unchecked, could take them just as easily. It left behind a chilling question: how many lives are worth sacrificing for the sake of discovery, and who gets to decide? The David Reimer case. A story that was never meant to be an experiment, a life that was never meant to be a test subject, a boy who became the center of one of the most infamous psychological studies in history, not by choice, not by consent, but by the decisions of those who believed they could shape identity itself. It began in 1965 in Winnipeg, Canada, with twins, Bruce and Brian Reimer, two healthy baby boys born into an ordinary family. At just 6 months old, both developed a medical issue, phimosis, a condition where the foreskin of the penis is too tight. Doctors recommended circumcision, a routine procedure. No one thought much of it. But something went wrong. Bruce, the first twin to undergo the procedure, was subjected to an experimental electrocautery technique, a method using an electric current instead of a blade. It was supposed to be safe. Instead, it was catastrophic. His penis was irreparably burned, destroyed beyond repair. The damage was irreversible. The doctors had no solution. The Reimers were devastated. Then came an answer, or at least, what seemed like one. Enter Dr. John Money, a psychologist at Johns Hopkins University, an influential figure in the field of gender identity. Money had spent years pushing the theory that gender was not innate, that it was learned, shaped by upbringing, molded by socialization, rather than biology. To him, Bruce Reimer was not just a tragedy, he was an opportunity. Money proposed a radical solution: raise Bruce as a girl. He argued that if Bruce was given a female name, dressed in female clothing, and treated as a girl from infancy, he would naturally develop a female gender identity. His theory was simple: if you raise a child as a girl, they will become a girl. Desperate, the Reimer family agreed. Bruce became Brenda. His parents followed the psychologist's instructions. No one told him the truth, but nature does not always follow theory. At first everything seemed fine, but as Brenda grew older, things did not go as planned. She rejected dresses, resisted traditional female behaviors, refused to conform to the role imposed on her. While her twin brother Brian developed naturally as a boy, Brenda struggled with confusion, anger, and discomfort she could not explain. Dr. Money continued to study Brenda, using her as proof that his gender theories were correct. His research was published, celebrated, referenced in academic circles. What the world did not know was that Brenda was suffering. In private therapy sessions, Money forced Brenda and Brian into disturbing situations. He made them reenact gender roles, encouraged them to engage in bizarre sexual role-play exercises, all in the name of proving that Brenda's transition was working. He used intimidation, manipulation, pressure. It was not working. By adolescence, Brenda was severely depressed. She threatened suicide. She refused further treatment. The truth could no longer be hidden. At age 14, her parents finally told her everything, and then Brenda made a choice. She rejected the life that had been forced upon her. She changed her name again, this time to David. She underwent hormone therapy, reconstructive surgery, and began the process of reclaiming the male identity that had been stolen from her. But the damage had been done. David struggled with his past, with the weight of a childhood built on lies, with the psychological scars of years of forced conditioning. His twin brother Brian, who had grown up under the shadow of the experiment, developed severe depression and later took his own life. David tried to move forward. He married. He became an advocate, speaking publicly against the experiment that had defined his life. But the trauma never fully faded. In 2004, at the age of 38, David Reimer took his own life. The experiment had failed. Dr. John Money's theory was in ruins. His belief that gender was purely a product of socialization was exposed as dangerously flawed. But for years his work had already been accepted as fact, shaping policies, influencing medical practices, misleading generations of parents and doctors. David Reimer's life was not an experiment, but it was turned into one. His story forced the scientific world to confront the limits of human manipulation. It proved that identity is not something that can simply be assigned, erased, or rewritten, like an academic theory. It is something deeper, something that no amount of social conditioning can completely override. And it left behind a question that no one could answer. How many other lives were shaped by this experiment before anyone realized the truth? The twin experiments of Josef Mengele, a name that lingers in history, spoken in whispers, synonymous with cruelty and horror. A man whose obsession with genetics, heredity, and racial purity turned one of the darkest places in human history into his personal laboratory. It was not science. It was not medicine. It was something else entirely. An experiment in suffering, a nightmare disguised as research. It began in the early 1940s, in the vast expanse of Auschwitz, the largest and most infamous of Nazi concentration camps. Here, under the shadow of war and genocide, Dr. Josef Mengele carried out a series of medical experiments that defied morality, ethics, and reason. He was searching for something, the secrets of twins, the mechanisms of heredity, the key to genetic superiority, and to find it, he needed subjects. He did not need to look far. Twins who arrived at Auschwitz were immediately separated from the rest of the prisoners, while others were marched toward gas chambers or forced into grueling labor. Twins were spared for a different kind of fate. They were taken to special barracks, given extra rations, and assured that they were safe. They were told they were special. They were told they were part of something important. It was a lie. Mengele oversaw thousands of twins, most of them children. Many were no older than 5 or 6 years old. He walked among them in his pristine white coat, smiling, speaking kindly, giving them candy. He was called Uncle Mengele by some, their innocence shielding them from the truth. But that kindness was a mask. His experiments began with measurements, observations, documentation. He recorded their heights, weights, eye colors, hair textures. He compared them meticulously, searching for patterns, for differences, for evidence of genetic control. But the real horror came later. Twins were subjected to painful and invasive procedures with no anesthesia. Their limbs were measured, their bodies prodded, their organs inspected. Blood was drawn in massive quantities, often to the point of exhaustion. Some were injected with unknown substances, chemicals, bacteria, diseases, just to see what would happen. Mengele had a particular obsession with eye color. He wanted to know if it could be changed, manipulated, artificially altered. He injected chemicals directly into children's eyes, leaving many blind or in excruciating pain. If a twin died during an experiment, the other was often killed immediately, so their bodies could be dissected for comparison. Some experiments were even more disturbing. He attempted to create artificial conjoined twins by sewing siblings together, stitching their bodies at the hands, at the spine, at the internal organs. The wounds became infected, the pain unbearable, the results nothing but horror. He recorded everything, every death, every failure, every moment of agony. But there was no real science behind it, just obsession, cruelty, and the belief that he was playing God. The twins who survived lived under constant terror. They never knew who would be taken next, who would return, who would disappear forever. They held hands, they whispered to each other in the dark, they clung to the last shreds of hope in a place that had none. And then, in 1945, Auschwitz was liberated. The soldiers who entered the camp found hundreds of twins, malnourished, sick, traumatized. Many had lost their families, their parents, their brothers and sisters. The world learned the truth of Mengele's experiments, but Mengele himself was gone. He fled, escaped justice. He vanished into South America, living under false identities, evading capture for decades. Survivors of his experiments searched for him, demanded justice, told their stories to the world. But Mengele never faced trial. He died in 1979, drowning in Brazil, his crimes never punished, his victims left with nothing but memories of what had been done to them. The twin experiments of Josef Mengele were not science. They were torture, disguised as research. They were suffering, inflicted under the name of progress. They were proof of how knowledge, when pursued without humanity, can become the greatest evil of all. And they left behind a question that can never be answered. How many more lives would have been lost if history had not intervened? The Frankenstein head transplant, a name that sounds like fiction, like something from a horror novel, an experiment so unnatural that it seems impossible, but it happened. A real attempt to do what had only ever existed in nightmares and science fiction, to sever a head from one body and attach it to another, to defy nature, to break the rules of life itself, to see if consciousness could survive when ripped from the body it was born into. It was 1970, at the height of medical experimentation, when Dr. Robert White, an American neurosurgeon, set out to do the unthinkable. He had spent years obsessed with one question: could a brain, the core of thought, memory, and identity, be removed from one body and placed into another? Could a head, fully detached from its original vessel, be revived on a different body? He believed the answer was yes, but belief was not enough. He needed proof, and for that, he needed a subject, not a human, not yet. That would come later, he thought. But first, a monkey. The procedure was unlike anything attempted before. 2 monkeys were used. One would be the donor, the other the recipient. The goal was to remove the head of one and attach it to the still living body of the other. It required precise surgical techniques, steady hands, and an acceptance of the grotesque. The first step was decapitation. The donor monkey's head was surgically removed, severed cleanly from its body. The spinal cord was cut. The blood vessels were clamped. Every connection between the head and the body that had once sustained it was severed. Then came the transfer. The severed head was placed onto the body of the recipient monkey, where the doctors worked quickly, racing against time to reconnect the blood vessels, restore circulation, and attach the nerves. They could not reconnect the spinal cord, not yet, not with the technology they had. But they could see if the brain, the face, the eyes, if consciousness itself could remain intact. Then something impossible happened. The monkey opened its eyes. It blinked. It was alive. For the first time in history, a living creature had survived a complete head transplant. Its brain was functioning. It was aware. It could track movement with its eyes. It could chew. It could swallow. It could not move. Its spinal cord had been cut, paralyzing it from the neck down, but its head was very much alive. It had survived the unimaginable, but it did not last. The body rejected the new head. The immune system, sensing something unnatural, attacked it. The body shut down. The experiment had succeeded in proving that a head could be kept alive, but it had failed in the one thing that mattered, sustaining life beyond a few days. The transplanted head, despite all efforts, was doomed to die. Dr. White did not see this as failure. To him, it was a first step, a moment in medical history that proved something incredible, that the mind and the body were not one and the same, that a brain could be separated from its original vessel and still function, that a new body could, in theory, carry a transplanted mind. He dreamed of pushing the experiment further. He envisioned a future where human head transplants could become a reality, where those with terminal illnesses, degenerative diseases, or paralyzed bodies could be given new life, their heads placed onto fresh, healthy bodies, a cure for mortality itself. But that future never arrived. The world was not ready. The medical community recoiled in horror. The ethics were impossible to ignore. The thought of transferring human consciousness like a machine, of taking one person's body and making it another's, of severing identity from its physical form, it was too much. Funding was cut. The research faded. The experiment was pushed into the shadows, remembered not as a breakthrough, but as something monstrous. Decades later, others would revive the idea, claiming that technology had finally caught up with the dream, that human head transplants might one day be possible, that Dr. White had been ahead of his time, but to this day, no human has undergone the procedure. The Frankenstein head transplant remains a symbol of both possibility and horror. It proved that life could be sustained beyond what nature intended, that identity could be separated from the body. But it left behind a chilling question. If a human ever undergoes a full head transplant, will they still be the same person, or will they wake up as something else entirely? The Artificial Mother Experiment, a study that changed everything we thought we knew about love, attachment, and the unseen forces that shape who we become. It was supposed to be about science, about understanding behavior, about measuring the immeasurable, but in the end, it was about something far deeper, something primal, something that stretched beyond psychology and into the very core of what it means to feel safe, to feel loved. It was 1958, and Dr. Harry Harlow, a psychologist at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, was fascinated by one of the most fundamental questions in human development. What makes a bond? For decades, scientists had believed that infants attached to their mothers only because they provided food, that love was secondary, that it was nothing more than an evolutionary trick, that the only thing keeping a baby close to its mother was the promise of nourishment. But Harlow wasn't convinced. He believed there was more to love than just survival, and he set out to prove it. He needed subjects, infants, helpless, searching for comfort. He turned to rhesus monkeys, primates with social structures and attachments eerily similar to humans. He separated them from their mothers immediately after birth, isolating them in cages where they had no warmth, no familiarity, no comfort, only science. Then he built their replacements, 2 artificial mothers, 2 machines designed to take the place of something irreplaceable. The one was built from wire and metal, cold and unfeeling, but equipped with a feeding bottle. The other had no food, no nourishment to offer, but was covered in soft cloth, warm to the touch, mimicking the feel of real fur. Then he introduced the infant monkeys to their choices. According to the logic of the time, the experiment should have been simple. The babies should have clung to the wire mother, because it gave them food. Love, after all, was nothing more than a byproduct of necessity. At least, that's what the scientific world believed. But that's not what happened. The monkeys rejected the wire mother. They would go to it only when they were starving, only when they had no choice, only to drink the milk that their bodies needed. And the moment they had taken enough, they would immediately retreat to the soft, cloth-covered mother, the one that had no food, but had something else: comfort, warmth, safety. They would cling to it for hours, pressing their tiny bodies against it, wrapping their arms around it, burying their faces in its softness. And when the scientists tried to scare them, introducing loud noises, sudden movements, unfamiliar objects, their first instinct was always the same. They ran to the cloth mother, even though it did not feed them, even though it offered nothing but a feeling. They chose it over everything else. Harlow had proven something that should have already been obvious. Love is not just about survival, it is about security, about attachment, about the invisible threads that bind us together. The babies did not just need food, they needed to feel safe. But the experiment did not end there. Harlow wanted to know what happened when there was no mother at all, so he went further. He raised infant monkeys in total isolation. No mother, no cloth, no wire, no comfort. Some were kept in this isolation for weeks, others for months, some for an entire year. The results were devastating. The isolated monkeys became broken. When they were finally reintroduced to others, they could not function. They cowered in corners, rocking back and forth. They did not know how to interact, how to communicate, how to form any connection. Some refused to eat, some harmed themselves, some lost the will to live, and the worst part, the damage was permanent. The longer they had been in isolation, the harder it was for them to recover. Those who had been isolated for an entire year never adjusted, even when given a normal social environment, even when surrounded by others, even when given the opportunity for connection. They could not take it. Harlow had done more than prove that love mattered. He had proven what happened when it was taken away. His findings changed psychology forever. The belief that infants only attached to their caregivers for food was shattered. Science could no longer ignore the role of comfort, warmth, and emotional security in development. His work laid the foundation for attachment theory, for the way we understand human relationships, for how we treat children who have been neglected, abandoned, or deprived of love. But it came at a cost. Harlow's methods were controversial, brutal, ethically disturbing. He did not hesitate to cause suffering in the pursuit of knowledge. He defended his work by saying that human children suffer in the real world, that understanding isolation and attachment could save lives. But for the monkeys who had been subjected to his experiments, there was no justification. They had suffered, not for treatment, not for healing, but for science alone. The artificial mother experiment proved that love is more than biology, that comfort is not a luxury, that attachment is not optional, and it left behind a haunting realization. If a child is deprived of love, if they grow up without warmth, if they never feel safe, do they ever truly heal? The Japanese Unit 731 Experiments, a name that was buried for years, hidden beneath layers of secrecy and denial, a horror that was not spoken about, not acknowledged, not punished. It was not science. It was not medicine. It was something else entirely. An experiment in cruelty, a war against the human body, a glimpse into what happens when ethics are abandoned in the name of progress. It began in the 1930s in Japanese-occupied China. During the rise of the Imperial Japanese Army, Japan was expanding, conquering, seeking dominance in the Pacific. But war is not just fought with weapons. War is fought with knowledge, knowledge of disease, of biology, of how to break the human body in ways that guns and bombs never could. And so Unit 731 was created. It was a secret research facility, hidden in Harbin, Manchuria, disguised as a water purification plant. But inside, it was something else. It was a human experimentation laboratory, designed to test the limits of pain, infection, survival. Thousands of prisoners were taken, Chinese civilians, Korean rebels, Russian soldiers, Allied prisoners of war. None of them would leave alive. They were known only as logs. That was the name Unit 731 gave them, Maruta, meaning wooden logs. It was a way to strip them of their humanity, to make them something less than human. The scientists and soldiers who worked there did not see people, they saw data. The experiments were beyond comprehension. Vivisections were performed without anesthesia. Prisoners were cut open alive, their organs removed while they were still conscious, their bodies studied as they slowly died. The researchers wanted to understand how diseases spread inside a living body, how long a person could survive with their stomach removed, how the brain reacted to exposure. Frostbite experiments forced prisoners to stand in the freezing cold, their limbs exposed until they turned black with necrosis. The doctors then poured hot water over the frozen flesh, or struck it with sticks to see if the limbs would break off like ice. It was not treatment. It was not an attempt to save them. It was observation, nothing more. Disease testing was widespread. Plague, cholera, anthrax. Prisoners were infected deliberately, sometimes injected with the diseases, sometimes forced to drink contaminated water, sometimes exposed through the air. Some were tied to wooden posts while plague-infested fleas were released onto their skin. The goal was not to cure them, it was to watch them die, to see how fast, how violently, how predictably the sickness would take hold. There were weapons tests. Some prisoners were locked inside gas chambers, exposed to chemical weapons, their bodies studied as the poison filled their lungs. Others were tied to stakes in open fields, bombarded with grenades, flamethrowers, machine guns, just to record how the human body reacts to different forms of attack. There were forced pregnancies. Female prisoners were raped by soldiers, impregnated, then used for experiments. Some were infected with STDs. Others were subjected to forced abortions, their bodies studied for signs of medical weakness, their unborn children discarded as biological waste. There were pressure tests. Prisoners were locked in compression chambers, the air slowly removed, their lungs expanding until they ruptured. Some were injected with air bubbles, causing embolisms and strokes. Others were deprived of food, of water, of oxygen, just to see how long they would survive. It was a factory of death, operating with precision, with routine, with scientific detachment. And when the war ended, when Japan surrendered, when the world began piecing itself back together, Unit 731 was erased. The United States, eager to gain access to Japan's biological warfare data, struck a deal. The scientists of Unit 731 were not put on trial. They were not executed. They were given immunity in exchange for their research. The knowledge gathered from human suffering was deemed too valuable to destroy. The records were sealed. The atrocities were classified. The men who carried out these experiments were allowed to return to normal lives. Some even became leaders in Japan's medical and pharmaceutical industries. There were no Nuremberg trials for Unit 731, no global outcry, no justice, but the survivors remembered, the few who had escaped, the families of those who had been lost, the whispered testimonies that spread through China and Korea. They remembered, they demanded recognition, they demanded accountability. But for decades, the Japanese government denied everything. Unit 731 did not exist, they said. The stories were fabrications. It was not until the 1980s that the truth began to surface. Survivors spoke out. Declassified documents revealed the extent of the experiments. The world could no longer look away. In 2002, China opened the Unit 731 Museum, a memorial to those who suffered in the name of science. But the scars remained. The legacy of Unit 731 was not just in its victims, it was in the knowledge it created, the secrets it uncovered, the diseases it experimented with. Some researchers believe that data from Unit 731 influenced modern biological warfare, that its findings, gathered through suffering, still echo in medical research today. And it left behind one of the most haunting questions in history. How many lives were saved because of knowledge that was bought with torture? And does that knowledge justify the cost? The Memory Manipulation Experiment, a study that blurred the line between reality and illusion, between what we know and what we only think we know. It was not science fiction. It was not a story from some dystopian novel. It was real. An attempt to alter memory itself, to change the past, not by rewriting history, but by rewriting the mind. It was 2016, and researchers at Radboud University in the Netherlands were working on something that had once seemed impossible. They wanted to see if memories, those fragile, deeply personal records of our experiences, could be edited, reshaped, even erased. They were not looking for a cure for amnesia. They were not trying to repair lost memories. They were asking something far stranger. What if the things we remember aren't real? And what if science could make that happen? The experiment was built on decades of research into memory distortion. Scientists had already known that memory is not a perfect recording. The brain does not store events like a camera capturing video. Instead, memories are reconstructed each time they are recalled, and that reconstruction can be altered. The researchers brought in volunteers, people who believed their memories were solid, trustworthy, unshakable. They told them fabricated stories about their own lives, stories that never happened but were designed to feel real. Stories like getting lost in a mall as a child, committing a minor crime, experiencing a traumatic event. Then they applied suggestion, repetition, reinforcement. They showed fake evidence, used leading questions, created doubt. They told the volunteers that their family members had confirmed these events. They did not force them to believe. They simply planted the seed and let the brain do the rest. And then something astonishing happened. People began to remember things that never happened. They recalled details, sights, sounds, emotions. Some described the moment they had gotten lost in the mall, the feeling of panic, the voice of a security guard who helped them. Others spoke about committing a crime they never committed, about interactions that never took place, about childhood experiences that were nothing but fiction. The false memories were not vague, they were vivid, detailed, convincing. To the people experiencing them, they were just as real as their actual past. The implications were terrifying. If memories could be implanted, shaped, rewritten so easily, then how much of what we remember is real? How much of our past is just a reconstruction of something that might have never happened? If a simple experiment could do this in a controlled setting, then what about the world outside? Eyewitness testimony, personal history, identity itself, how much of it is built on illusions? The researchers had proven something shocking. The past is not fixed. It exists only in our minds. And if our minds can be changed, then so can our pasts. But the experiment did not stop there. They took it a step further. If memories could be implanted, could they also be erased? Could trauma be edited out of a person's mind? Could painful experiences be softened, rewritten, removed entirely? They turned to a powerful tool, a beta blocker drug called propranolol. It had been used before for anxiety and PTSD, but now they were using it for something different. Volunteers were asked to recall a painful memory, something that had haunted them, something that carried weight. As they remembered, they were given the drug. Then over time, the emotional weight of the memory faded. It was still there, but it no longer hurt. The trauma lost its power. The event itself remained, but it became distant, detached, like something that had happened to someone else. The implications were both promising and terrifying. If traumatic memories could be weakened, it could mean an end to PTSD, to lifelong suffering, to the grip of fear and pain that holds so many in its grasp. But if memories could be altered at will, then what happens to truth? What happens when memories are no longer reliable? The experiment left behind a world where memory was no longer just a record of the past. It was something malleable, flexible, fragile. It was something that could be manipulated, and it left behind a chilling realization. If the mind can be rewritten, then who are we really? If our memories define us, but those memories can be changed, then how much of ourselves do we actually control? The public shaming experiment, a study that did not take place in a laboratory, that had no controlled variables, that was not conducted by scientists in white coats. It was an experiment carried out in the real world by millions of people with consequences that no one predicted. It was not about medicine, psychology, or biology. It was about human nature, about how quickly we turn on one another, about how a single mistake can spiral into destruction. It was 2014, and Justine Sacco was just another person on the internet. She was not famous. She was not powerful. She was an ordinary PR executive, boarding a plane, making an offhand joke on Twitter, a joke that would change her life. Before taking off on a flight from New York to South Africa, she tweeted, "Going to Africa. Hope I don't get AIDS. Just kidding. I'm white." She put her phone away. She did not know what was coming. The tweet was meant to be satire, a joke about privilege, about the absurdity of stereotypes. But on the internet, context is lost. There is no tone. There is no room for misinterpretation. There is only what people decide you meant, and the internet decided. By the time her plane landed, she was no longer Justine Sacco. She was a villain, a racist, a monster. Her tweet had gone viral. Thousands of people had seen it, then tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands. Her name was trending worldwide. Justine Sacco became synonymous with everything wrong in the world. People were calling for her to be fired, banned, exiled, and she had no idea. She was still in the air, disconnected, unaware. As she slept on the plane, people were waiting for her to land. The hashtag. Justine landed, yet spread across Twitter. People were tracking her flight, mocking her, celebrating the destruction of someone they had never met. By the time she touched down, she no longer had a job. She was fired before she even knew what had happened. She had lost everything before she could even defend herself. Her life had been decided by strangers, but the experiment did not stop with her. Justine was the first, but she would not be the last. Public shaming had become a game. In the months that followed, more people were pulled into the fire. A man made a joke at a tech conference. Someone overheard it, tweeted about it, and within hours, he was fired. The person who reported him was then shamed herself, harassed until she lost her own job. A woman posed for a photo at Arlington National Cemetery, making a joke about a sign that said silence and respect. It was meant to be ironic. The internet decided it was offensive. They found her job, her address, her family. She lost her job, received death threats, had to hide from the world. A teenager made a crude joke about an airport bomb on Twitter. It was obviously a joke. He was arrested, charged with a crime. His name was permanently attached to an offhand comment. It became a cycle. Someone made a mistake. The internet pounced, and their life was destroyed in real time. The public shaming experiment was not designed by scientists. It was not controlled, measured, or studied in a lab. It was an organic phenomenon, a new kind of punishment, one with no rules, no mercy, no way to escape. And it raised a terrifying question: what happens when the punishment never ends? When a person commits a crime, they serve their time. They are punished, rehabilitated, given a second chance, but the internet does not forget. A single mistake, a single joke, a single moment of poor judgment becomes a permanent stain. People who participated in these viral shamings found that years later, their names were still tied to them. Job applications were rejected. Background checks brought up nothing but controversy. The shaming was no longer just a moment. It was a life sentence, and it was not just for the guilty, because sometimes the internet got it wrong. A man was wrongly accused of being the Boston Marathon bomber because of a viral post. His name, his face, his personal information was shared across the world. By the time the real suspect was caught, his life had already been destroyed. A woman was falsely accused of abusing a dog in public after a manipulated video went viral. She received death threats, hate mail, people showing up at her house. The truth did not matter. The shaming had already done its damage. The internet had created a new form of mob justice. It was no longer about laws, courts, facts. It was about outrage, about who could be destroyed next. And it left behind a chilling realization: in the age of public shaming, anyone can be the next target. A single mistake, a single misunderstood joke, a single moment caught out of context, and suddenly, your life is over. The experiment had no conclusion, because it never ended. The Violinist in the Metro, an experiment that did not take place in a laboratory, that had no test tubes, no white coats, no electrodes. It happened in the real world, in the everyday routine of ordinary people. It was not about medicine, not about memory, not about pain. It was about something far simpler, yet far more profound: perception, about what we see, what we miss, what we value. It was 2007, and the Washington Post had a question: if you placed one of the greatest musicians in the world in the middle of an ordinary setting, dressed as a street performer, anonymous, unnoticed, would anyone stop to listen? Would beauty, out of context, still be recognized? The violinist was Joshua Bell, a man who filled concert halls, whose performances commanded hundreds of dollars per ticket, who played a Stradivarius violin worth $3.5 million, a musician at the peak of his craft. But on January 12, 2007, he became something else. Dressed in jeans, a long-sleeved shirt, and a baseball cap, he walked into the Lenfern Plaza metro station in Washington, D.C., a place of transit, of rushing, of routine. He opened his violin case, left it open for tips, and began to play. He did not play casually. He did not hold back. He played Bach, Schubert, Massenet, some of the most intricate, emotionally powerful pieces ever written, the kind of music that could bring an audience to tears, that could fill a concert hall with standing ovations. And then, something strange happened. Nothing. The music filled the station, but no one noticed. For 45 minutes, Bell played. 1,097 people passed by, men in suits, women in high heels, students with backpacks, workers heading to jobs they could not be late for. Most did not even look. Some glanced briefly, then kept walking. A few turned their heads, as if recognizing something unusual, then disappeared into the crowd. Out of nearly 1,100 people, only 7 stopped to listen. 7. A world-class musician, playing one of the greatest instruments ever crafted, performing music that had survived for centuries, and almost no one cared. The people who did stop, they were not business professionals, not people rushing to important meetings. They were children. Again and again, kids turned their heads, slowed down, tried to stop, and every time, their parents pulled them away, hurried them along, made them keep moving. In 45 minutes, he made $32.17. 3 days earlier, Bell had played to a packed theater in Boston. Seats had sold for over $100 each. But here, in the chaos of morning commutes, his music was nothing more than background noise. The experiment was over, and it had proven something unsettling. Context is everything. Had Joshua Bell been in a concert hall, had he been dressed in a tuxedo, had people been told that they were listening to one of the greatest musicians of their time, they would have wept, they would have leaned forward in their seats, closed their eyes, let the music carry them away. But in a subway station, he was just another street performer, and in the rush of life, art became invisible. The experiment revealed something about how we experience the world. How many moments of beauty do we miss, simply because we are too busy to notice? How many things do we overlook, not because they lack value, but because they are in the wrong place, at the wrong time, in the wrong context? And what does that say about us? Bell later reflected on the experience. He did not fault the people who ignored him. Life is fast, people are busy. The world does not stop just because something beautiful is happening. But he also noted something that could not be ignored. The children noticed, they heard something, they felt something, and they were pulled away. It raised an unsettling thought. Do we learn to ignore beauty? Do we grow up to believe that there is no time to stop, no time to listen, no time to feel? Do we train ourselves to push past the things that once caught our eyes as children? The Violinist in the Metro Experiment was not just about music. It was about attention, awareness, what we allow ourselves to experience. And it left behind a question that lingers. If the greatest violinist in the world played just for you, would you even hear it?